Yes, I think there's no better opportunity than this morning, and I would like to inform about a very concrete initiative. CNFA, Cultivating New Frontiers in Agriculture, is a premier agriculture non-profit development organization. GSI, a global brand of ECHO, is a world-class manufacturer of grain storage material, handling material, conditioning and drying equipment, as well as a full-line supplier of swine and poultry production equipment. Today, CNFA and GSI Group have launched a strategic partnership here in Washington aimed at promoting food storage and protein production systems as a critical way to improve farm productivity and food security in Africa. This partnership will notably strive to significantly reduce the multi-billion-dollar food losses that occur yearly due to insufficient and inadequate post-harvest infrastructure and storage in sub-Saharan Africa. It will also leverage CNFA's close proximity to thousands of smallholders in Africa with GSI cutting-edge technologies. And it's almost self-funding because the after-harvest losses today in Africa are more than 50%. If you invest here, the return on invest is coming in within less than a year. Thank you very much.
We've got about 5 minutes, so if people just have interventions or quick questions, I'd go with that. Peter?
Yeah. First of all, Shelley, terrific job. I just want to add one or two other things to our list of things to think about. Among other things, we'd like to see a greater focus on infrastructure projects in information and communications technology. Thank you. Communications technology. For example, companies who do business in Africa need node sites, they need electrical lines, and better connectivity. And as Melissa mentioned last night, her African Sunrise Partners research report was just published on a detailed Africa information communications technology report. So it's certainly current among other people's thinking as well. This affects financial services and all other industries in Africa. ICT plays a critical role in enhancing African trade and is needed to boost entrepreneurship, innovation, job creation, and the export potential of African countries. ICT can ease cross-border communications, financial transactions, and sharing of data and information. Further, ICT is relied on by African governments and helps bring more transparency and openness to those governments. Its infrastructure provides a reliable mechanism to communicate and share information, and it plays an important component of reliable data and dissemination and ultimately bond issuance by African governments. So I suggest one of the things that we add to our list is making robust and resilient ICT infrastructure an important and key priority for the DBIA Council to focus on.
Thanks. I'm Michael Punk from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and I'm the U.S. Ambassador to the World Trade Organization, and our agency had lead responsibility for negotiating the Trade Facilitation Agreement. I just want to comment very briefly on our efforts to implement. We're very gratified to see the recommendation for the U.S. taking a leadership role in securing implementation. Obviously, the significance of the agreement is only achieved when it comes into force. And the way that happens mechanically is when 2/3 of WTO members have ratified individually. As Shelley mentioned, the U.S. became the third member of the WTO to ratify in January. Just 2 weeks ago, Mauritius became the fourth WTO member to ratify and the first African member, which we think is a very strong signal. One hopeful thing that is an action enforcing event for the end of the year. The WTO has its 10th ministerial conference, which is hosted this year by Kenya. Kenya's Foreign Minister, Amina Mohammed, has called for achieving implementation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement as a goal for the ministerial conference that they're hosting. And so certainly we're working to use that as an action-forcing event in rallying support around the world. We're doing that in a number of ways, including through capital and including through working with some of our interagency counterparts, including USAID, to focus on the capacity building side. So just wanted to comment on that briefly.
Thank you, Michael. Maybe one more comment, and then we'll have to move on.
Hi, Eric Postel. I manage USAID's business in Africa. We're happy to work with you to use some of our risk mitigation tools, which are in dollars and local currency, to work on that. We fully agree on the cold chain storage, and under Feed the Future, a bunch of different agencies are all recognizing the importance of that, but we need to do a lot more, as you're pushing us to do. And then to build on Michael's point, and vis-a-vis this bullet that says in terms of trade facilitation and coordination with the private sector, we're working jointly with USTR, other donor governments, and U.S. private sector companies to build an alliance of people to put real money behind an effort to work on these various impediments to trade. And we're looking not just to coordinate with the private sector, but we are inviting the private sector to be part of that, right at the table, making all the decisions. Some U.S. companies have already tentatively agreed to join, and we'd welcome any others that want to join, because we're working on this now and hope to have it in place by the time that the countries have all ratified and we're ready to go, so that we have a robust package of support that speaks to every one of these bullets, which are very, very important. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eric. Secretary Pritzker.
First of all, I endorse your recommendations, but let me go to something, Shelley, I think that you proposed that I think we should think about how we might operationalize, which is some sort of interagency committee that works with a subgroup of this council on baseline barriers. And I think that kind of public-private partnership could be very effective in two ways. One is we're already doing a lot, but I think that, we're disparate and we're out doing our thing, whether it's USTR or USAID or, USDA, et cetera, and it can give greater awareness to the private sector of what we're already doing. It could also give greater lift to our own activities if we're better partnered up, so that if USAID is looking for another partner or we need more push in certain countries, there's better coordination. So I think we ought to explore it, not right now, but take that offline as an opportunity.
Great suggestion. Well, thank you, Shelley, for that. And I think we'll shift now to infrastructure. And Jay is chairing that group. So over to you, Jay.
All right, thanks, Dominic. Jay Ireland with General Electric. I get to talk about the infrastructure work that's been done. I'd like I live in Nairobi, been there for 4 years. So yesterday I felt right at home when the power went out. Yeah. And, but anyway, I think infrastructure is absolutely key, as we all know, to solving a lot of the problems in Africa, as well as economic growth as we go forward. It touches all the bases that you've already spoken about, and whether it's the financial side, as far as needs, as well as some of the trade and supply chain discussions that have already occurred. I think the way to think about some of the recommendations that the subcommittee has gone through there are three key ones. One is Africa Infrastructure Center, second one's healthcare, and the third one's around manufacturing and services, and I'll have some of our other committee members talk about some of those. But on the Africa Infrastructure Center, I think the important thing is to think about how we go to market as private sector companies that tend to be mostly American versus some of our competitors. When you look at China as being one of the major competitors, and as well as some of the other countries, Turkey now, we're seeing more in Africa as well as India. And what they do is they lead with their government and bring along their businesses or their companies. And they lead with their government with whether it's financial money or support, studies, et cetera. And then they bring along whether it's a state-owned enterprise out of China or one of the private sector ones in India or in Turkey. What I think is, from our perspective, is to think about the way we go to market, which is a private sector-led initiative with a basket, if you will, of capability driven by with the government's, what the government can do to help us, whether all the agencies, et cetera. And I think that's one of the thoughts around this infrastructure center from that standpoint, is to make sure that we all understand what help there is out there, where we can lean in and get more help. Obviously, we need some more coordination within some of these areas, but generally, I think that's one of the ways. We have been very supportive of Power Africa as an initiative in utilizing it in a similar vein, and I think that's been important. We spent yesterday with some of the players there around the table and talking about what we can do to improve that and really get it even further along from the standpoint of helping companies really do business in Africa. So I think from that perspective, if we think of it in that way, it may also help companies that are not there yet. Obviously, some of these initiatives around information flow, et cetera, is going to be very helpful as well. But I think the biggest thing is to know where there is a backstop and somebody behind you from a standpoint of support. So I think that's one of the things this infrastructure center may add on to. I don't know if Kevon or anybody want to add on to that. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you so much, Secretary Pritzker, Chair Barton, and Chair Daniel, Vice Chair Daniel. The development of the U.S.-Africa Infrastructure Center is a pivotal step towards bridging Africa's infrastructure gap and is a necessary investment tool in developing a market where U.S. companies are competitive with their international peers. As stated in the recommendation, identifying, vetting, and prioritizing the enormous number of infrastructure projects can be almost impossible for small and medium-sized enterprises. So small and medium-sized enterprises play a vital role in creating jobs and growth in America's economy. As so, it is critical the development of the U.S.-Africa Infrastructure Center includes programs that address the unique barriers to project development and execution that small and medium-sized enterprises face. Additionally, the recommendation calls for the participation of the Department of Commerce, State Department, Exim Bank, USTDA, and OPIC to ensure that SMEs are systematically represented at the center. The addition of the SBA is welcomed as well. So I just wanted to make sure that we advocate on behalf of small and medium-sized enterprises. Obviously, I think everyone on the council shares that mindset in terms of making sure that there's appropriate representation and support. But certainly I agree with everything Jay has characterized, and certainly we intend to use as SoEnergy the infrastructure center when it is developed. Thank you.
Excuse me, if I could add a comment. I also agree with the comments that Jay provided and with Kevon as well. When we think about Africa, we talked in the last several days or couple days about Africa wants to do business with American companies. And sometimes it is difficult. We're talking about the SMEs right now. The very large corporations may have the opportunity to make those introductions. But as we try and align what we offer to Africa and what Africa has asked of us, we do business very well together. I think, again, they enjoy working with American companies, but it is difficult. As we talked about some of the interagency opportunities, this infrastructure center would be one of those examples that will help us bring together a means of competing better. Sometimes competition means just even knowing about the project, not to mention then having a solution that the customer or client wants to buy from us. So I think this center will be really pivotal in helping us really bring together two common interests. We want to do business, we want to help the continent of Africa, and likewise. And I think it also has to have presence not only here in Washington, D.C., and the interagency element of it, but also on the continent, in the countries and places that we've targeted. Infrastructure is such a dynamic need, but not to have the ability to bring people to the table and talk about the needs. It's really an important element, and it's one of the things that may not necessarily be executed in the very, very near term, but it's a requirement as we move down the journey to be able to make those connections and communicate.
Do you want?
We've got two more, but Jay, were you finished in what you wanted to do?
Well, I was
or
going
do
to
you-
talk about healthcare and manufacturing, but we'll go to
Sorry
these.
if we just do, maybe just close off on that, and then we'll
Sure.
open it up. Is that okay?
The another recommendation was on healthcare infrastructure, and I'll let Dow Wilson talk about that. But I think the Ebola impact this last year and a half has been pretty devastating, more from an economic impact than it had. It's been devastating on a personal impact as well, obviously, but it has impacted the rest of Africa as well from an economic aspect, especially in tourism. And I think one of the things is it's really about public sector capability in the healthcare sector. And that definitely needs to be built up. And as bad as the Ebola crisis was, there'll be 20 times more babies that'll die in their first 28 days in Nigeria this year than all of the Ebola deaths. So there's 250,000 babies that die in the antenatal. And those are the things that public health sector in the long run is going to really help on economic growth. So I'll let Dow, wherever.
Yeah, I think that that's a very exciting recommendation that I think we have here to extend the hierarchy of needs analogy a little bit. The opportunity we have is to strengthen the primary care capability in Africa. So whether it's Ebola, HIV/AIDS, infant and maternal care, or in many cases in Africa, the largest killer of adult women is cervical cancer, a cancer that's virtually eliminated in the West. And if we had proper primary care at a very basic level, you know, we could tackle a number of disease categories and really make a very significant public health impact as well as an economic impact. So our recommendation is that some of the current funding mechanisms that came out of Ebola and other places lack the flexibility to kind of address Africa's underdeveloped healthcare infrastructure. And if we could somehow just open up that flexibility, the funding's there, and it would tackle some of the ongoing communicable disease issues, as well as give us really significant progress on the non-communicable disease side. So I think that's a very exciting recommendation. Really allowing for investment in basic health care training and infrastructure at that level, building the preventive medicine, diagnosis, and long-term therapy needs of the country. We also looked at the need for really defining what a public-private partnership is and getting some defined terms out. I'm not going to belabor this one. I think the recommendation is pretty clear in the book. But you know, PPP means different things to everybody, and you know that's a frustration, especially if you're a small or medium-sized company, as was previously noted in another way. Trying to figure out how to navigate that is very difficult. And if we could advocate for stronger international consistent standards, that would be terrific. And then I think last of all, we wanted to just highlight the linkage between healthcare infrastructure and energy infrastructure. And if there were some way to kind of really bring those together, you know, so much in a clinic starts with a light.
Lights.
And you know, you can't see what a simple operation is. You can't diagnose a skin lesion, whatever it might be, and really to kind of make some of the current appropriated funds available to help the energy infrastructure, healthcare in some entities would be terrific. Thank you.
And then the final one is the manufacturing and services, which is somewhat similar to what we've heard about working with the regional economic communities on a government-to-government basis. And Karen, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or.
No, I think, as we talked last night, there are so many countries in Africa, but there also are regional issues that exist that we can attack and put in place a number of, we talked about trade agreements, we talked about the ability to partner within regions and those are very important elements of what we need to do to get the infrastructure in place. And I absolutely agree with Dow about the electricity and all the other needs in the healthcare world. Your statistic about babies dying.
Jay, if I could just add a comment
Yeah.
here. For a lot of us in kind of the low volume business, we have a good year, we make 700 of something. Shelley sells that in 28 seconds in some Walmarts. But the localization requirements can be very, very difficult, and especially if we have each country asking for localization requirements. So we'd love to see advocacy around, could you include technology transfer? Could you include services? Could you include training, and really get at some of the other things that are really part of the package, not just, hey, can we build, in our case, a medical linear accelerator in your country? We're not going to have the scale in a lot of these countries to do that, but if we can definitionally get at it another way, I think it'd be very helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. We had a lot of discussions about that last night. And just a last word on infrastructure, Shelley. Those 16 landlocked countries, we're going to do our best to connect them with the ports through the rail system with GE locomotives. So just
GE's everywhere on that. Now, we have 5 minutes. This is, again, most of our recommended 3 of the 8 are actually in this group, so I think we should spend time. But if I could suggest, we're just going to go around with the people that have them up, but if you could, again, don't mind me being a pain in the ass on this, just quick interventions or reviews so that everyone can get a chance, and then we'll close off with the Secretary. Wanda.
Yes, thank you. The U.S.-Africa Center, as Karen noted, should require a on-the-ground presence, and we think that's very important in order to develop and sustain relationships. It's very critical to the way Africans do business. It's a cultural dynamic. We tend to be more transactional. As Elizabeth noted earlier, there are limitations on the ability of government agencies to have that sustained presence because of resources. While I agree that the commercial service officers are a very valuable resource there, I mean, there are a couple of things I'd just like to know quickly. National Security Advisor Susan Rice mentioned in her comments that the President had a strategic review of our goals in Africa in 2012, and as part of that, the President directed every agency to develop a strategic plan as to how they would institutionalize his goals in Africa. And Ex-Im Bank convened a group very similar to this. In fact, 2 of the companies represented here were on it and contributed. And one of the things that we recommended, which actually was a follow-on to a recommendation that was made in 2008, was to have offices on the ground, that European export credit agencies, many of them had offices on the ground in order to champion their commercial enterprises, and that with respect to commercial attachés, China, as an example, this was in 2012, had 155 commercial attachés on the continent, roughly 3 per country. We don't believe that we can really expect the commercial service officers to be fluent in Ex-Im Banks about our products and about our financing requirements and screening. As Karen noted, it's important to be on the ground because, particularly with respect to infrastructure projects, the long lead time required for the planning of those projects means that you need to be there talking to people. And I would suggest that this is an outcome of our strategic plan back in 2012, that what is really required for Ex-Im Bank to have a presence on the ground is an amendment to our charter and an appropriation which would specifically finance that. It's something that could come out of the fees that we charge. We earn money over and above our operating costs, and that would allow for the appropriation of a specific budget item for that.
Just quickly, pivoting off of my colleague's commentary around bringing power and healthcare to the people. So Energy recently received a directive and endorsement from Madam President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia to provide our healthcare infrastructure solution to address the post-Ebola strategy process to a particular hospital in Liberia. And our solution is multi-purpose. It provides healthcare facility and laboratory, et cetera, along with a power solution that kind of combines and brings that synergistic play. We need support from folks from around the table, specifically OPIC, USAID, I'm looking at, to allow for the redirect, if you will, of funding in support of that post-Ebola funding mechanisms. So if we could talk about that, I'd greatly appreciate it. And I think that the recommendation certainly supports our desire to make sure healthcare becomes a long-standing part of the infrastructure discussion going forward. So.
Thank you very much. I'm Eno Ebong from the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. I'm very, very pleased to be here and hear all of the recommendations which very much speak to our mission, which is to link U.S. industry to infrastructure opportunities across the continent and around the world. I wanted to say that we welcome all of the recommendations, and in particular the Infrastructure Center, but really just talk about two, I think, areas where we create an environment, I think, which would assist in the effectiveness of such a center. I wanted to comment ever so briefly on our Global Procurement Initiative, which I think we've heard through the recommendations an emphasis on the need to be able to compete for our U.S. companies on a level playing field. Our initiative has focused on best value determinations so that the least cost initiatives that currently sort of have prevailed are not the only alternative. And so that's something where we focus, and there were comments on the need to train. So we've taken a three-pronged approach: training on the ground, study tours in the United States, and then the opportunity to embed in-country advisory assistance. So that's one area we feel that will help to create an environment where our industry can compete. I would just like to mention and really announce the creation of, and it dovetails a little bit on the comments on energy and earlier on standards, a U.S. Clean Energy Standards Program, where, again, going to the long term and making sure that it's something like an infrastructure center can be successful, is looking at standards and helping to share with those who are responsible for standing them up, for regulatory systems, making sure that they're exposed to industry-led and internationally accepted standards, and particularly in the area of clean energy. We look to you for guidance as to where we might successfully target markets and for areas where you might be particularly helpful there. So I just want to end with that.
Thank you very much. You know, again, we've only got a few minutes, so if you could just keep it pistol-like in terms of the comments, that would be great. Elizabeth.
Okay, pistol-like. I wanted to just, first of all, welcome these recommendations and then make a couple of suggestions of other things that might be considered at a more granular level, in addition, that such an infrastructure center might consider. You know, when we talk to our developer clients and investors in infrastructure, broadly speaking, whether it's power, telecoms, healthcare, logistics, one of the things we hear is they're not worried about regulations anymore or fixing regulations. They're much more worried about political will and execution capability at the ministry level. So to the extent this infrastructure center could think about how it might help advise and influence ministries on their, you know, sense of political will, their execution capabilities, and their sense of urgency. The second thing we're hearing, and particularly in the energy sector, is real concerns around the creditworthiness of off-takers. You know, as as most of the energy produced in Africa used to be sold abroad, now it's being used domestically. And that, so working on the creditworthiness of those off-takers is something, for example, that AID might focus on. And then again, the energy sector, bankable power purchase agreements, again, is an area that this infrastructure center might focus on. And then lastly, and sort of counterintuitively, there's a couple of countries whose infrastructure, and in particular energy build-out, like Mozambique, is creating some concerns about resource curse. So I think there may ironically be a role to play for advising on the creation of sovereign wealth funds or other facilities that might prevent the creation of resource curse countries. And then lastly, I want to just echo what Kevin said, and that is, I know we all know how exciting the growth in Africa is, but I think we all should share the concern about making sure that growth is inclusive and actually leads to the betterment of the lives of ordinary Africans. So from that perspective, really focusing on the development dimension of this investment and folding in SMEs, I think is something we all need to bear in mind.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Donald.
Thanks very much. Donald.
John.
Hi, John McWilliams, Department of Energy. We would welcome a much longer conversation on energy, but I will attempt to be very pithy right here. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact, as we all know, that there are 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that don't have regular access to electricity. When you combine that with the growth rates we've been talking about, we're going to have enormous infrastructure needs in energy. I want to commend the Council and support the recommendations that we've heard, specifically the infrastructure center, and also, as mentioned by Dow and others, the interdependency between energy and, in this case, healthcare. Energy is interdependent with so many different aspects of growing modern society. Won't go through all of those, but we as a technical agency are basically involved in technical assistance, capacity building, and bilateral relationships that we have with a number of African nations, and we would be very pleased to participate in all of these. Thanks.
Thank you.
Melissa Cook from African Sunrise Partners. And as Peter mentioned, I did a very large study on information and communications technology access in Africa. And it's not only an exciting area in which the U.S. has world-leading companies, but it stands to transform African economies in terms of new businesses, healthcare delivery, government services delivery, e-commerce, education, and financial services. As part of the infrastructure subcommittee, I had a number of conversations with companies in the ICT sector. I just wanted to give some of their feedback, which is the forced localization issue is a very big challenge for them. And I think as we have these trade development conversations with African countries, I think it would be very helpful to remind everybody that the reason they want forced localization is to create jobs in their own countries and to prevent just the extraction of value from their countries, as has typically been the case. So if we can shift the conversation to try to get countries and policymakers to think more about the full ecosystem, the full value chain, the economic complexity that's required for them to sustain job growth, that would be a very helpful direction for that conversation to take. I also had feedback from companies that their customers can't get financing. Exim Bank financing is frequently not available for various reasons, and that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
thank you. Government has a certain amount of power, but really we believe that this partnership with you all is critical because, you know, we tend to be talking about the eat your spinach on the reforms, but if they hear it combined with, we need you to shift on this so that we can help you with the ecosystem and especially point to examples where this has happened, that is more powerful than just a government-to-government discussion. So I would really urge that. And finally, of course, we can all organize ourselves better here to provide support, and I heard all the agencies saying that. There is also, in my mind, a puzzle about how much the difficulty is a shortage of bankable projects and how much it's the definition of bankable. In other words, are there projects that really could make sense, they just need a little starter fuel, or is there much more of a problem of getting the organic support for and the organic flow of pipeline projects? Because I think that businesses, you know, you're the guys who can see how to make that happen, can see business opportunities in a way that, you know, however well-intentioned the government, you know, and we'll, the government bureaucrats, and I don't include Secretary Pritzker, of course, are not going to be so good at doing. So I just urge you to keep on the good work. Thank you.
Let me say just two really quick things. I'm not going to comment on the whole array of recommendations, but the infrastructure bank or infrastructure center I think is very interesting. I wanted to address this notion of going to market with the government leading versus business leading. And one of the things that we've been toying with is the idea of an American package concept. Are there large enough infrastructure projects that we form an MOU with that government that creates the outlines of what the U.S. government will bring to the table in large projects that could give the government leadership imprimatur that I think the private sector is looking for in Africa. So I would ask you to spend more time with our staffs thinking about that. The second thing I would say is I just want to make sure that you're aware in the Advocacy Center we've now created the Global Infrastructure Initiative where we have agreements now with India and the Philippines on specific advocacy for specific, because they would like us more present in their infrastructure build-outs. So we should talk also more about how do we make better use of those kinds of instruments.
Excellent. Well, thank you for a good, robust discussion. Again, 3 of the 8 were in there. I think it deserved the time. But Karen, maybe back to you to get us back on track. A better job than me.
Okay, Rahama.
In 8 minutes.
We have 8 minutes left, and we are going to shift to the Marketing and Outreach Committee that was led by Ms. Wright. Ms. Wright is the founder and CEO of Shea Yilin Health and Beauty Products, and she is going to provide some insight on, we've talked a lot about what it takes to do business there, but she's also going to address the really important issue about the perception of doing business in Africa.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Secretary, Chair Barton, Vice Chair Daniel, and honorable guests. Thank you for the floor. The Marketing and Outreach Subcommittee focused on issues of perception and business engagement through 2 business roundtable discussions, one in Accra, organized with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the other in Chicago, hosted by fellow council member AAR. We were able to expand our dialogue to include the perspectives of U.S. businesses already engaged in or interested in doing business in Africa. Through our dialogues, we identified the perception U.S. companies have of Africa as a critical component in their business decision-making. It's no secret people want to do business with people that they know, they like, are comfortable with, and trust. To most American business leaders, the continent of Africa is an unfamiliar region with more challenges than opportunity. A quick scan of major business publications often reveals stories that reveal risk and chaos in African countries. This past week, a lot of the focus was on the attacks in Kenya, and in previous months, the media really focused a lot on Ebola, which is important. These stories need to be told, they're important, but they also disproportionately focus on the challenges and perpetuate negative perceptions that hinder U.S. business engagement. Our subcommittee asserts that the opportunity to succeed in Africa outweigh the risks. The McKinsey Global Institute reports that there are more than 400 companies around the world whose Africa-based revenue exceed $1 billion. Additionally, Africa's spending is growing, set to rise from $860 billion in 2008 to $1.4 trillion in 2020. Despite this significant progress, it's clear that many American business leaders are unaware of the potential Africa holds to expand their businesses and increase their profitability. The U.S. International Trade Administration, an agency within the Department of Commerce, reports that exports to Africa are only 1.6% of total U.S. global exports. Perception issues are further compounded by limited understanding of how to navigate the business landscape and engage in strategic investments and opportunities using an approach that accounts for regional, cultural, and other differences around the continent. As a result, most American businesses interested in Africa often struggle to find market data and to develop a clear understanding of African consumer markets. So this is where the U.S. government can step in. The government is well positioned to address the issue of perception and to help U.S. companies overcome the knowledge barrier. The Council recommends 3 actions to change misconceptions about doing business in Africa and to inform a broader segment of the U.S. business community about the market opportunities in Africa. The first action is to collect and publicize case studies and best practices and also share success stories of companies that are doing well in Africa. Additionally, there can be a partnership between the public and private sector, engaging business schools, engaging the Minority Business Development Agency to help inform research and really gather the data that's needed to make a case for doing business in Africa. Our second recommendation is to forge partnerships between the government and the private sector to create unique multipliers. For example, there are about 3,000 Peace Corps volunteers who are currently serving in Africa. These volunteers can provide their perspectives on what it's really like to live and work in Africa. And they can also inform the business community and give a different perspective on what it's like to engage in doing business in Africa. The diaspora community is also an effective and important resource in addressing the perception issue. The U.S. Census Bureau reports that foreign-born Africans account for about 4% of the American population. This demographic can be a resource and a partner in engaging dialogue, and we recommend facilitating town hall meetings that bring together the diaspora, people within the business community, as well as government officials to really talk about how to improve the perception issue that's hindering the business engagement that we are all looking for, we're all looking to increase. Our third and final recommendation is specifically addressing the knowledge gap about doing business in Africa. And by developing and disseminating an online toolkit, this online toolkit will serve as a one-stop guide for U.S. companies to get access to a comprehensive list of resources that the government has to help them in terms of engaging in business activity. It can also provide guidance on the best points of entry and provide market and consumer data in addition to other resources. Access to and availability of information, resources, strategic partnerships, and understanding of the global marketplace are key components of successful trade engagements with Africa. Therefore, addressing the perception issue and developing better trade resources can facilitate and enhance trade between the United States and Africa. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk about this important matter, and I turn the floor over to other individuals on the committee who can offer their perspective.
Thank you, Dominic, and those are great recommendations. I just want to add, if I may, the following, and that is the role that journalism plays in society and democracy is critical. If well-trained, the contribution that financial journalists can make as continental informers, educators, and watchdogs is very significant. To advance financial journalism in Africa, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Mike Bloomberg's foundation, has launched the Bloomberg Media Initiative Africa, which aims to increase the pipeline of skilled financial journalists and analysts and embrace a data-driven journalism culture across Africa. Bloomberg has collaborated with a consortium of preeminent journalism schools and top business schools across 3 key African markets, in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, to deliver a highly innovative, integrated, and practical world-class executive training program. We've also announced at Bloomberg LP and our media group a multi-year rolling partnership with Nigeria-based content provider Optima Media Group, which will produce 3 to 4 hours of business programming per day and be available to African viewers across the continent. Optima Media Group will engage its existing content and distribution channels to supplement Bloomberg's English language, international news, and analysis across Africa. This is the latest component of our wider strategy to partner with leading providers in markets that have a compelling economic growth story. We're able to provide viewers with the sharpest global business and financial insight, as well as, for the first time, highly localized and market-specific content. Content will be produced in Lagos, Johannesburg, London, and Nairobi with dedicated presenters, reporters, and producers based in each market.
Peter, I don't know, we're just going to have one intervention, then go to the Secretary. I'm afraid we're just running
that's
the clock.
fine. I just wanted to indicate that the faith-based community in the United States is very interested in connecting with the diaspora, connecting with African American, for example, and Hispanic small businesses, to connect to the trade, commerce, and aid discussion going on in Africa, and should be included as a part of the outreach and communication that Rahama is recommending. So I'll quickly summarize there.
Thank you.
Well, just on this issue of outreach, I think one of the things to keep in mind would also be data. What is the data that businesses need to make decisions about focusing on Africa, and how do we collect that data? I know there's no agency within or department within the federal government that wouldn't love more guidance in that area. So, and it would be useful in our programming and policy decisions. So that would be something where getting granular about that advice would be helpful, I think, for all of us.
I'm afraid we're going to have to close up on that, given the time schedule. It's not to diminish the importance of this last broad recommendation just on making people more aware. I think there's a very big gap. You were talking about that last night, Secretary Pritzker, just about how few businesses, especially small businesses, are aware of the opportunity and the ease of being able to get access to it and so forth. I think it's a very important initiative. The other thing, Peter, I'm thinking for every recommendation we do, I think Bloomberg, we just attach on a donation like that. It'll be very good in the process. So if there's any more coming up, we'll look to you.
It would be our pleasure.
Yeah, okay.
But I don't speak for the boss normally.
Yeah, okay. I think at this point we should close off on these recommendations. I don't know if Karen has anything you want to add to this part on the.
I'm going to let you close. I think you've heard from me a lot.
Okay, thank you. We have heard from Secretary Pritzker, Madam Secretary. We absolutely appreciate the opportunity to be here today and work through the recommendations that the Council has put forward. We've talked a lot about the opportunities that exist, and I want to go back to the point that was made yesterday, that really great things happen when the private sector business leaders come together with the public sector and take on a bold agenda. And while we've talked about we need to do some bold things, I think just the establishment of the Council is bold. Tapping into the expertise that we have around this room will better position us. We also have talked about the implications of partnering. None of us can do what we do if we didn't have good partners to do it with. So that idea of the various things that we've talked about vertical integration, the infrastructure center, and so forth, they all represent partnering opportunities for us to then go to Africa and work with our partners in Africa. The third thing I'd like to say is that we cannot sustain the economic growth and some of the business activities that we've been talking about for the last day and a half without engaging in the community. The community is really, really important, and I think we all know that. We've talked about the relationships that are important. We like to do work with people that we have great relationships with. So the community in Africa is really important. As we talked about young leaders, the next generation, providing jobs, but it's also really important as we do our work to transfer knowledge and skills so that there is an ongoing workforce and a continuation of the middle class in Africa, which is really bringing about this opportunity for us. That's really important. I think one other item that I would say in closing, I have really enjoyed the opportunity to get to know many of the people around the room ever so briefly, but we will spend additional time together this summer, taking the input from Secretary Pritzker and making our recommendations more specific. We'll get to those that have a higher sense of urgency. We will also lay the groundwork, we hope, for doing business in Africa for a very long time. But one thing Secretary Pritzker said yesterday that really resonated with me, it's not only an opportunity and our responsibility to make this happen, it's also an opportunity to serve our country. And that is really important as we come together and then take some of the good work that we're doing to the countries and parts of the world that really need our help. Not only provide a business opportunity, but really to do the right thing and make Africa realize the potential that it has in front of it. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Appreciate it. Our Black and Beach family are happy and committed to keep going and make it happen.
Great. Well said, Karen. There's one formal thing I'd like to do just before we hand it over to the Secretary to close, and that's to the council members to ask if there are any objections to the 8 recommendations. If there are not, they will be put in place. So any recommendations or any objections? Then they're approved from our group to it. So thank you very much on that. Well, as Karen mentioned, there are next steps. We do need to make sure that they're actionable. As the Secretary has mentioned, as Karen said, we'll work over the summer. We have another meeting that will be coming up in the fall, I believe in October, November. Tricia's trying to work the calendars, trying to figure out how we get all this done with Matthew. And I think I've just counted here, and I know Karen's been keeping notes, at least 11 other ideas that have come through that we need to look at. And we'll obviously have to prioritize them and so forth, as well as some ways to make them more powerful. But over to you.
Terrific. I just want to say 2 things. First is thank you very much for your time and your attention to this very important initiative. If the President wasn't as committed to Africa, I'm not sure that this group would have been put together, but he handed us the baton, and you guys have really run it very far down the field. There's a lot of work to do to take recommendations from ideas and pieces of paper to actual execution. And so I continue to focus on the fact that it's our job to work with you, all of us from the federal government, to put these ideas into the ones that we can into practice. And the more granular, the more specific, the more we work together, the better the potential is for us to achieve the kind of outcomes that I think this group has the potential to show as results. So thank you all very much, and I appreciate all the time that we've spent together over the last 2 days. Thank you.
We thank you very much. We have Valerie Jarrett is going to be joining. She's on the way momentarily, and then we'll formally close. Brett, whatever, yeah. We're done. Yeah.
We're done. So why don't we say thank you, and if when she comes, we can. I just don't know.
Yeah, good idea.
Okay.
Good idea. Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.